The piano lessons. Now, me and BW go back a long time, to a much simpler time. Our friendship started before we began grammar school. In fact, I can't remember not knowing him. He was my best friend. I once had a very wise old man tell me that when you got into the late winter of your life and could look back and count 5 real good friends you'd had, you were a very lucky man. And he was right. Now, there are all kind of definitions about what a good friend is. You know, someone you'd loan your truck to, or let hunt your best dog, or trust your family safety to. My favorite definition, though, is a good friend is someone that sees through your act, but likes you anyway. BW was all those things, and more. For a lot of years, on my fistful of friends, he was my thumb. You see, your thumb is what helps you keep a grip on things. We attended grade school together for a while, and then I moved away, but we stayed in contact by summer and holiday visits. Speaking of moving, by the time I graduated from high school, I'd moved 8 times between the Chattanooga area and the North Georgia area. I think every time the rent come due, my daddy would move. I was always the new boy in school. And there were 6 different schools during those 12 years, and 2 summers. I finally moved back to our hometown and we finished high school together, and then we were roommates in college. It didn't take me long to figure out that I probably didn't have much of a future in higher education. So off I went into the military. He lasted 1 more year, and then he also decided on a different career track. I told him I was twice as smart as he was. It only took me 1 year in college, and it took him 2. Now, we were not related in any way, but looked enough alike to pass for brothers, which we did on occasion to help a joke along. Our most distinguishing feature, according to my daddy, was our ears. He said we looked like a couple of cars coming down the road with both doors open. Now, BW's house was about 2 miles down the highway from mine, and we either walked or rode our bicycles back and forth just about every day, even at night, and without helmets. Maybe the pavement was softer in those days, or our heads were harder. Boy, times have changed. We were actually perfectly safe. Like I said, it was a much simpler time. During those early years, we were together most all the time, sort of like Tom and Huck. Only folks referred to us as Pete and Repeat. You saw one of us, you saw us both. We also managed to get into enough stuff to make Tom and Huck look like choir boys. We both had a pretty wide streak of Eddie Haskell in us, too, which came in handy when we got old enough to become interested in girls. That came on pretty early, too, matter of fact. We sort of adopted a philosophy of catch on real quick, but grow up slow, and I am still trying. We managed to stay about 1 jump ahead of our parents, too, or at least we thought we did. He had some older brothers and sisters at home to help deflect some of their attention, but as an only child being raised by a village, I had a little harder time of it. Once in a while, we would realize that our folks were just a little sharper than we gave them credit for. An example was our piano lessons. For some reason or another, our parents, our mamas really, decided we needed to take piano lessons. Neither one of us was too thrilled with this announcement, but we went along with it, as if we had a choice. My daddy said he had already taught me how to play a jukebox, and that'd probably be all the musical instruction I would ever need. The way it was explained was that BW said he would take them because he was told I said I was. I was told that he said he was going to, and that I was chicken if I didn't. Well, that settled that. There was a very healthy dose of competition between us about most things. But if anybody messed with either one of us, they had to contend with both of us. I told you, sort of like brothers. You remember in the old Western movies when the Indian and the paleface would cut their wrist and hold them together to mingle the blood so as to become blood brothers? Well, we had done that, only we didn't cut our wrist. We weren't that dumb. What we did do was heat up the blade of a pocket knife and prick the end of our thumbs and held them together. We figured that since we were both palefaces, Not near as much blood was required for the job. We also made some pretty heavy-duty promises during that little ceremony, and some of them actually were kept in later years. Anyway, back to the music lessons. It didn't take long for us to figure out that we'd been had, but by then it was too late. The music teacher in town at that time was Miss Ruby Lee. She was very good and was confident that she could make great pianists out of us, but I saw it. I did. I detected a brief look of apprehension in her eyes when we showed up together for our introduction to the wonders of the piano. We had pitched such a fit about not wanting to be the first to go that going together the first few times was finally agreed to. She had a lot of students over the years, but I bet we were some of her most memorable, and probably not for our talent. We were given books, and she demonstrated some scales and just basic piano things. I wanted to push the pedals, but she told me those were for advanced students only. But after a year of hard work and practice, I might get to use them. That's the first I'd heard you had to practice this stuff. That first lesson wasn't so bad, but they got longer and longer. It was the same week that school had started for the year, and we were in the second grade. The weather was still hot, the new blue jeans were still turning my legs blue from the dye and sweat mixture, and I could think of a gazillion things I'd rather be doing. B.W. had a piano at home, but I had to go next door to practice, to the Presbyterian church that was across the vacant lot from our house. I could go in and use the church's piano because my grandfather, who we lived with at the time, had donated the land for the church and was a chief elder or whatever, and also the custodian and maintenance man as well as the Sunday morning bell ringer. I dreaded going in there by myself. I was convinced that old building was haunted, and I was sure God was in there somewhere, lurking, watching, to make sure I practiced like I was supposed to. Now, I was not then, and I am not now, superstitious, but I did then, and I do now, believe in ghosts and haints. I knew the sounds from the belfry were pigeons, and the creaking sounds were caused by the wind, but I wasn't sure enough to gamble on it. You know, in later years, I went back in that church, and it had shrunk. It looked about a third the size it was when I was 7 years old. That first week, I really practiced. I thought for sure I'd wear that old upright out, but it beat me. By the end of that first week, I knew I was in trouble. I flat did not like the piano. My mother was convinced I could learn to play. She was one of those people that could hear a song, any song, one time, and sit down and play it correctly. Could not read music, never had a lesson in her life, but could absolutely play the keys off one. It was sickening. Me, I could barely spell piano, much less play one. She thought I was just not trying, and after a few weeks, she was right. Our second session with Miss Ruby Lee caused me to get a whooping. Now, you folks that were raised in the country, you know that a whooping is about 3 times worse than a whipping, and I got whooped. Me and B.W. had gone back together for our second lesson. He showed up with a smug look on his face. Come to find out, that rascal had a natural affinity for the piano. Wouldn't you just know it? She started out with me, sat down on the bench beside me, and asked me, "Now then, where is the middle C?" With all the seriousness I could muster and still keep a straight face, I told her that as far as I could find out, the middle C was almost directly between the red and the dead. She didn't bat an eye, she didn't smile, she didn't say a word, and that's when I knew I was in trouble. B.W. was sitting back there doubled over laughing, and she turned around and cut him a look that would have stopped a freight train. He straightened up in a hurry, and even politely volunteered to show me where it was on the keyboard. I wanted to kill him. By the time I got home, they already knew what I'd said. My daddy thought it was the funniest thing he'd ever heard. Mother gave him a look and accused him of putting me up to it, then proceeded to wear me out. I didn't know until then that music lessons could be hazardous to your health. She informed me that I would continue the lessons and would learn to play the piano if it killed me. After what I just received, I was convinced it just might. Well, I struggled along. I'd found out that if I could get B.W. to show me once or twice, then I could play the week's lessons enough to get by. I'd already given up on learning how to read music. It might as well have been Chinese. In mid-November, the announcement was made that the holiday recital by Miss Ruby Lee's students would be given just before the annual Baptist Church Christmas pageant. For the first time in my young life, I did not want Christmas to come as soon as possible. The pageant wasn't a big deal to me. I was only a shepherd. I was trying to work my way up to being a wise man, but I still hadn't made that. Oh, I dreaded that recital. You see, most of Miss Ruby Lee's students were girls. In fact, B.W. and me were the only boys in that year's recital. We had already had to convince some of our classmates that we could and would still fight, even if we did take piano lessons. And she decided that we would perform a duet. Me in a duet? I had barely mastered chopsticks, and she wanted me to play a duet? B.W. could actually play pretty well, and as he never got tired of telling me, he could read the music too. We worked and worked. It still sounded horrible. At least my side of the keyboard did. I was resigned to the fact that I was going to make a complete fool of myself. And then, guess what happened? The day before Doomsday, I came down with an absolutely beautiful case of the measles. I was never so glad to be sick in my life. I actually enjoyed throwing up. My mother said she'd never seen anyone smile and throw up at the same time before. They said the recital went well and that B.W. did good. I often wondered what half a duet sounded like. Also, one more or less shepherd wasn't even noticed. Shortly after I had breathed a sigh of relief for missing the worst night of my life, it suddenly dawned on me that prayer works. I had made all kinds of promises to God to get me out of that recital. Well, I figured that if it worked for recitals, it just might work for that new bicycle I wanted for Christmas. But it didn't. It was 2 years before I got that new bike. I heard someone say long about then that God works in mysterious ways, and I informed them that he could be a mite slow sometimes too. As far as music is concerned, B.W. did continue a little longer, but my mother gave up on me after that recital deal. I did finally learn to play an instrument, though. I became a pretty good drummer. Drum music is pretty easy to read. If there's a dot on the line, and it's always the same line, you hit the drum. All it takes is to be able to count and have a little rhythm. Now that made sense to me. B.W. may could have read piano music, but I found out I had rhythm. You remember those grade school rhythm bands with sticks and blocks and triangles and such? Well, that is another whole story. Uncle Buney. I attended a meeting the other night, which, by the way, when I say the other night, it could have been last week or a year ago. And as I sat there, I began to wonder if I really belonged in this particular group. The 9 men present consisted of 3 lawyers, 2 bankers, 3 high-dollar real estate types, and me, a blue-collared high school graduate out of North Georgia. We are a literary discussion group known as the Dumb Poets Society. I remember some teachers that would be amazed to find me in this group. I figured that I had exactly 2 points of common ground with the others. I am a man, and I do read. Intimidation was not what I felt. I don't intimidate real easy. I was just aware that most of my discussions center around things like hiking and baseball, backpacking, mountains, trucks, NASCAR, and other good old boy non-academic pursuits. Anyway, shortly after we started talking about our book of the month, someone across the room spoke up and said that the bumbling police presence in our story reminded them of Barney, as in Mayberry's Barney Fife. Well, I immediately felt more like one of the boys. At least some of us watched the same high-caliber TV shows. That statement, for some reason, triggered a rush of memories about one of the classic lawmen I knew as a youngster growing up in a small North Georgia town. That little town has had a lot of policemen over the years, but this particular gentleman has always been my favorite. The middle 1950s saw my hometown as what I consider a typical small southern town of the times. Population was about 500, if you counted all the rural mail routes, and about half the graveyard. Well, if they could count them on election day, I can count them now. Crime was really not a major concern. You must remember that back then even moonshine making was what is now called a cottage industry. As an example of the lack of our fear of crime, our front door at the house didn't even have a lock on it. The occasional domestic spat or actions resulting from an overindulgence of the aforementioned spirits were about the extent of our civil disobedience. The main function of our constable, as I saw it, was to be the official door shaker of the town stores. Each store's front door was checked after dark by the vigorous shaking and twisting of the knob, so we called our policemen door shakers. To the best of my knowledge, no one ever checked the rear doors. It could have been because it was dark back there. The man I want to tell you about was called Uncle Buney. Really, that was his name. He was a fine man, and my recounting of some of the events surrounding him means no disrespect to him at all. Uncle Buney was obviously somebody's uncle, but I have no idea whose. Everybody called him Uncle. Now, all the stores in town at that time were on the west side of the highway across from the railroad tracks. The depot sat on the other side of the tracks facing the stores. Most all the stores in town at that time were within a 100-yard block bounded by two side streets. All the stores had common walls, so the block was one continuous building, with a double-wide overhang built out over the sidewalk. Sound familiar? Uncle Buney was very predictable on his nightly tour duty. His actions never varied. At exactly 10 p.m., he would walk down to the south end of the block and then turn around and come back, checking each door by the shaking and twisting method as he came back up the street. I never heard of him finding one unlocked, and like I said, the back entrances were never checked. I guess any honorable and self-respecting burglar would only use the front door. At the end of this exercise, he would sit down in an old ladder-back cane-bottom chair, which after some years fit him perfectly, if you know what I mean. He'd place his pistol, belt and holster all rolled up nice and neat under the chair. Alongside this roll would be placed his long chromium 6-cell flashlight. And on top of all this would be placed his hat. You remember those hats? Shiny black plastic build in either khaki or navy blue material. Truck drivers, policemen, filling station attendants, remember them? All wore the same type hat. That hat was the extent of Uncle Buney's uniform. It didn't even have a badge. If he'd have had one, it wouldn't have had a number on it. It would have just said only. Uncle Buney would then lean the chair back against the wall of the bank, which was on the corner, yawn and stretch, hook them Wellington boot heels over the bottom rung of the chair, fold his arms across his stomach, drop his chin on his chest, and promptly go to sleep. You remember that I said that the mention of Barney started all this? Guess why? Yep. Uncle Buney's pistol was not loaded. He carried the 6 bullets in a Bull Durham tobacco sack in his shirt pocket. Now this whole situation just begged to be exploited, and we did. I've known of any one or all the items to be removed from under that chair while the occupant snored away. Now they'd be placed in any number of places he was sure to look, including his own front porch. On occasion, if some of the town's young folks were really bored, they would go to the rear of the building directly behind where Uncle Buney was asleep and would launch lit cherry bombs over the roof toward the front. It only took one to get an instant response from our sleeper. The launch vehicle was a flip, or slingshot for you city folks. A cherry bomb, which is a fairly loud piece of fireworks, would be placed in the saddle, which was usually made from an old piece of shoe tongue. And then the shooter would pull the inner tube strips back to full stretch. And then his or her accomplice, and we really did have some girls that were as adventurous as any of us guys. They were not all shrinking violet Southern belles. Anyway, the accomplice would then light the fuse. Upon release, which had better be almost immediate for the obvious reasons, the crowd would rush around the corner to see the results, some of which were hilarious. If you can imagine a grown man trying to get his legs untangled from the chair's legs and get the chair bottom off of his bottom, it really was a funny sight. All you could see was elbows and knees just a-flailing. This stunt was done rarely, so as not to let the novelty wear off. It's a wonder some heart attacks were not caused. Fireworks were a constant source of entertainment. All that was needed was a little bit of imagination, and the possibilities were almost endless. And I bet we didn't miss many. One Saturday morning, my favorite Uncle Buney exploit took place. In those days, all the stores in town closed at noon on Wednesday and were open until noon on Saturday morning. It worked quite well. People who could not get to town during the week could shop on Saturday morning. There wasn't anything open on Sunday to take your money, except the churches. Anyway, on this particular Saturday morning, a call came that the bank, not one of the banks, mind you, but the bank, in the next town of any size some 10 miles north of us had been robbed, and the getaway car was headed south towards us. The sheriff requested that our town lawman stop him if possible. Well, let me tell you, some big-time excitement was generated then. First, the streets were cleared and Uncle Buney backed the town police car into the side street between our bank and one of our 2 grocery stores. Now, the car was a blue and white 4-door Ford, complete with a red gumball machine on top, a siren, and a teardrop spotlight mounted on the driver's door. Mounted on the rear bumper was a long 10-foot-tall police radio antenna, or aerial as some folks call them. We didn't have a radio, but that antenna sure made that car look official. That car looked just like Andy and Barney's squad car in Mayberry. The only difference was that we didn't have North Carolina tags. What we had was a piece of cardboard that read, "Tag stolen." After positioning the car, Uncle Buney did something that convinced me that he was deadly serious about his assignment. He took those 6 bullets out of that Bull Durham sack and loaded his pistol. I was positioned in the alcove entrance of the grocery store and saw the whole thing. I may be the only person to ever see him actually load that pistol. Sure enough, here came the desperado. He hit the railroad crossing at the north end of town, running about 100 miles an hour. As he approached Uncle Buney, who was standing on the side of the street, with that long barrel Colt in one hand and the other hand waving up and down like he was trying to flag down a Greyhound bus, the driver swerved at Uncle Buney and had the audacity to smile and wave as he went on by. This tempered Uncle Buney some, and he proceeded to fire off 3 shots. Bang, bang, bang! It was beautiful. You never saw so much blue smoke in your life. You couldn't even see Uncle Buney. There is no telling how old those shells were, but the powder must have been about half wet. Just barely through the smoke and haze, I saw the bank robber drive right on out of sight. Uncle Buney jumped in our blue and white and set off in hot pursuit, siren wailing and red light just a-flashing. Oh, it was a day to be remembered and talked about for years. After the smoke and dust cleared and people ventured back out on the street, we discovered that Uncle Buney had hit 2 parked cars on the other side of the street and had put one shot through the front window of the depot, which had sent our depot agent and telegrapher scrambling under his desk. Nary a shot had even come close to that robber's car. In about 20 minutes, one of my buddies came driving up, said Uncle Buney had gone by our local drive-in restaurant and hangout, which was about 2 miles out of town, wide open. I nearly died laughing. You see, for Uncle Buney, wide open was exactly 45 miles an hour. Uncle Buney never drove over 45. He said high speeds were terribly unsafe and he wasn't going to do it. When he passed the cafe, the light and siren were still going, even though by then he was out of the city limits and his jurisdiction, but he was so caught up in the chase he hadn't even noticed. He finally stopped at the county line, turned around and came back to town. By then, our robber must have been a good 15 minutes ahead of him. Now, I'd gone down in front of our drugstore because I knew Uncle Buney would go there first when he got back to town. A fairly good-sized crowd had gathered there by then. Uncle Buney drove back into town and backed the car into the city's parking place there beside the tracks. The siren was off, but the red light was still flashing. That struck me funny for some reason, but I didn't dare laugh out loud. But it was sure hard not to. I mean, after all, he was the law and deserved some respect. After he shut the car down, got out, and locked it, he walked resolutely across the street. Now, he was not your typical Hollywood stereotype Southern lawman. He didn't wear chrome sunglasses, and he didn't have a big old fat stomach. But he did have that walk. He walked like he knew exactly where he was going, but it didn't matter what time he got there. We all waited to hear what had happened. Uncle Buney stepped up on the sidewalk, took his hat off, and begun to wipe off that inner sweatband with his handkerchief as he sort of rocked back and forth on his boot heels. And finally, after what seemed like an eternity, he spoke. He said, "I'll tell you what, folks, if that feller had ever stopped, I'd arrested him sure as the world. So help me, it happened just this way."